Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Orthodox Nationalist. This is Matthew Raphael Johnson, and today is Wednesday, the 12th of October, 2022. Just a few days away from my 51st birthday. Just to throw that out there. And I do have a very important announcement. The book on nominalism, The Ontology of Death, is finished, and it's at the moment being approved by Amazon. Maybe by the time you hear this, it should be ready, and it should be available for people to buy. Possibly even there'll be ads up and links up too. I went through Romana Press, kind of like, my version of E. Michael Jones's Fidelity Press. And I've been through this thing with a fine-tooth comb. So either as you're hearing this, it will be ready, or shortly thereafter. I'll make sure everybody knows the moment that happens. So a book that was started between 2006 and 2011, as a book in 2011, is finally done. Over the years, I've given bits and pieces of it as talks here. And there's quite a bit of repetition because because we're talking about a very focused topic. We're also talking about centuries of patristic development. They're identical at their core, but in terms of whatever the issues were that were raging at the day, they're going to be a bit different. At the very least, you're going to have different points of emphasis, because the only reason that philosophy or academic theology is done is when there's a crisis. Philosophy, metaphysics, ontology, epistemology. This comes from emergencies, crises in public life. And of course, as far as the church goes, it derives directly from heresy, attacks on the church. You think of what the Bolshevik Revolution did, as far as the captive church there in the Russian Empire. It changed everything. They began with the old believers, the development of the priestless sect, and what they had to begin developing. No one would have really thought of that kind of thing before. But these crises, these emergencies, are the cause of all of this. So let me start. And I've had people ask me for more basic definitions, and that's a legitimate request. So let me go through this briefly. This is all kind of your introductory material for when you get the book. The term nominalism has been around since the High Middle Ages. I've spoken of William of Ockham before, who died in 1347. So you're certainly there talking about a crisis. The Middle Ages was on its way out. And in a little bit, you had both the 100 Years' War and the Black Death, which is what destroyed, for the worst, of course, the old and ushered in what's very dishonestly called the Renaissance. This is the fundamental, what we're talking about here. This debate is the fundamental constitution of reality. It's not political, although it does have political implications. It's not economics, but it does have economic implications. It is both a theological and a philosophical problem. Of course, nominalism comes from the word name. Now, the reason that William of Ockham, there's nothing new to the doctrine, but he certainly was the first to really systematize it. It had been around earlier, but he had enough pull to make it famous. So as much as the Black Death and the 100 Years' War Occam's work also brought the Middle Ages to a close. Occam rejected what philosophers call species, genre or species. Any categorization of things. That category, is it part of the constitution of reality, or is it merely a conventional term that we use because it makes it easy to talk about? William of Ockham, of course, in the nominalist school said, no, they're simply conventional things. They're words. So nominal, nomen in Latin for name or word, is born with the idea that when we talk about anything, we talk about a species of animal, even talking about something more basic like goodness or empathy, the different functions in social life, which I've made a big deal about in my work on Plato. Plato, of course, is the ultimate realist, the opposite of the nominalist. All realists are those who believe in the actual reality of archetypes, that they're actually in the spiritual world, of course, immediately connected with God. You can't talk about spiritual archetype. Forms, ideas, they're all the same thing. They're all synonymous. Without talking about God, because only God can create something that is as eternal as He is. What the Church Fathers did in their battles over the concept of logos, which means a lot of things. And in Greek, it does mean word, but that doesn't mean much as far as Occam is concerned. This word is the very definitions of things. To name something is to know it at its root. So it's not that they're names and that's all there are. They're nothing more than we group a group of things together because they look alike, and we give it a name. Everything that appears to us as red, we call a red thing. Again, either there is this, it's part of the pattern of creation and hence eternal, or they just kind of look alike. So it's easy for us to put these universal terms on. But there's far more significant examples. Love is, of course, one of my favorite, because people see individual instantations of love, loving acts. The nominalists will reject the fact that they really have anything in common. We just perceive it that way. And over time, we throw all of these loving acts together under simply the word love. It's nothing more than an abbreviation for all the individual acts of love that we think we see. Of course, no Christian can believe that, because love is something inherent to God. Of course, there is a archetype of love. Logos is the collection of all of these archetypes into the form of the good, because everything that exists is good. Evil is a perversion of things that exist. So that's the key element. We all use universals. We all talk about good people. We all talk about brown things. We all talk about machines that run well versus machines that run poorly. And machines may not be a great example because they're artifacts. We're talking about natural elements of the social and the natural world. But even an artifact comes from some aspect of human nature. The different forms and functions in any given society are in fact archetypal, because every society has to have this division of labor. So either these universal things are real, or they're just abbreviations that we kind of all agree on. But that's a mystification, because what we all agree, we didn't get together somewhere. That's imposed on us. It's what lies behind nominalism that matters. If universal things, objects, don't exist, then neither are there objective and universal truths. That's the problem. What that means, especially in Enlightenment terms, is that the natural order, and that includes humanity, that's all propaganda to somehow separate humanity out from all this. Humanity is as part of nature as anything else. And it's something that the Renaissance did, the Medici banking clan did a lot to cover up years after William's death. It's the implications here. Nature, the natural order, really, they can't even use words like order, because that implies inherent, universal, organic concepts. But the nominalist point of view, since there are no universals, there really are no species. These universals everything, they have 4 legs and whiskers and maybe a few other things. It seems arbitrary. And then we throw them together and give them a name. Whether it be animals or plants or bacterium. If you deny the reality of universal objects, then you deny the very concept of logos. Nature is then dead. Nature has no real meaning or purpose. As far as we're concerned, it's just a flux. The Ein Sof of the Kabbalah. And as you see in John Locke, and this is something I got from Leo Strauss, and it was an extremely important insight. John Locke's very famous second treatise says that value derives solely from labor. And I never considered what that implies. It implies that, so for example, if you take wood from the forest, you chop it up, you make a log cabin out of it, that then has value. It has market value. It has value to you personally. But the wood by itself has no value. The only purpose, the only reality that the natural order has is humans, men making something out of it. Otherwise, it isn't really anything. This is why industrialization, Darwinism, and they're very closely connected, desperately needed the total victory of the nominalist idea. Despite Darwin's title of Origin of the Species, he didn't believe in species. No nominalist can. Those are abbreviations of convenience. And William of Ockham was one of the first to really systematize this. So another way to talk about your realism is the belief that universal objects are real. A universal, and the philosophical way to put it is what William would say. A universal, in his sense, is that which can be predicated about many things. The predicate, good or beautiful, whatever, is merely a word to him. It's nothing more than an aid to communication. Words are quick and easy abbreviations that we will use to categorize reality, making it easier to reference. And it makes it easy to take the valueless nature and make it into something more valuable. So this view of the world, and I've been over this before, but it's worth repeating. When philosophy students first come across this, there's a very cursory introduction given in the intro classes, and then it gets more complicated as time goes on. It was a huge part of the Middle Ages. Even the pre-Socratic world had this problem. What a lot of young students fail to see is just how powerful this nominalist critique is. And it's very dangerous because it's extremely dangerous because it is so ingrained into our day-to-day life that even when I was in college and grad school, I really struggled. How do I first of all, how do I break out of this? And how do I argue against nominalism when the very language that we use, the modern world started a long time ago, this is something that we're used to now, implies that we've been born and raised with the idea that only individuals exist. Now we know factually that's absurd. So it not only means that nature is meaningless, it not only means that there's no truth in the world except in our minds, it also implies if the natural order doesn't have any purpose or universality about it, then what is it? It's a flux. We can't conceive of what nothing is. We always have to think of something. But the flux is as close as we can get. It's undefinable. So then, human language is, at least in one theory, is a means whereby the human will has struggled to force its purposes upon it. This is essential to Marxism, too, because both Locke and Marx accepted the labor theory of value. You can't talk about the labor theory of Marxism or liberalism without that. Marxism, especially, the entire Marxist enterprise, is that labor puts in a certain amount of effort, and that effort in the production of products then automatically has a price attached to it, more or less a market price, and there's other forms of pricing mechanisms. But the owner of the factory is going to sell something for a lot more than he gave you to make it. So that means at least a certain part of your labor is completely unfree. But this flux, the labor theory of value tends to imply that prior to labor being applied to something, that something is in fact veritably nothing. It's an attack on reality itself. When you hear it for the first time, it seems very obvious. Yes, it's hard to conceive, especially if you come from a secular environment. It's hard to conceive what human nature is. Now, human nature is, of course, a realistic archetype. All human beings. That doesn't necessarily mean every single person wandering around on two legs. But human being, as such, has a specific human nature typified by reason in many definitions of that term. There are properties. There are things like weight and color. Those are accidents in the medieval understanding. They're not essential. But what they adhere to in the nominalist world is a single concrete object, and there is nothing more fundamental than that. The modern empirical scientific mentality that's central to it. In other words, you can't have anything in the modern world, good, bad, or indifferent, unless you assume that only the individual will, the individual intellect, exists. Because even individual objects external to us, unless they're artifacts, don't have value. But they couldn't have value because they're simply individual. There's classes or products. That certainly doesn't exist in the natural world. You think of how species are categorized. There's no reference to logos, the order of creation. It's simply convenient. And that convenience, that abbreviation, everything that breastfeeds and has 4 legs is X. Over time, we take that as being natural. That's really how they're created, but in fact they're not. The entire evolutionary and alchemical doctrine says that these things are always changing. So in one millennium, it's X, another millennium, the same thing as Y. So properties, color and sound, that kind of thing, any individual object you come across, that's not really the issue. It's what they adhere to. A red what, a good what. Human language is, in a sense, a form of adaptation. The universal, which is at the core of realism, logos doctrine, etc., is a Platonic idea. You don't have to accept everything that Plato said to realize that his metaphysics became the metaphysics of civilization, in the best sense of the term. You can't have Christianity without it. These are termed ideas with a capital I, forms with a capital F, sometimes even nature with a capital N, like the nature of something, archetypes, and essences. And in the book, they're used synonymously. When I was in grad school, it was form, capital FORM, that was the dominant term. Ideas is also very important, but understand when you use the term in a technical sense, we're talking about a metaphysical thing, it's with the capital I. But those are at least the most common terms. And the anti-nominalist, from the realistic point of view, the Platonic point of view, holds that the world is made up of eternal entities existing outside of space and time, and all we get to perceive are these things vaguely outlined in a world that, due to our sin and problems that cause, the implications of that, seems somewhat of a chaotic world. These forms exist on their own, but we come to know them because they are instantiated in individual things, a sensible. A specific tree that we're looking at is an individual, is a sensible. But the form makes something what they are. Something is an object. Something actually exists as a thing only because it partakes of a more universal ideal. Because forms are the only real things in the universe, everything else is always changing, and that's where the word realism comes from. In theological terms, this is what is contained in Logos. Logos is, of course, the second person of the Trinity, or the content of God's thought, so to speak. We're using human terms here, of course. But God acts, God thinks. They are logically also God. Because if God thinks, again, we're using air quotes there, the thought is God too, because it is just as perfect as he is. But it is distinct. The Trinity only makes sense, it does make sense because, and so many people have struggled with this. I've never had a problem with the Trinity. And I've come across, I think it was Makrakis, to lesser extent Alexei Losov, who taught me about how the Trinity actually operates. Makrakis' idea is if God thinks and acts, those thoughts and actions that emanate from him, that proceed from him, that are generated by him, not created, but generated by him outside of time, are equally perfect, are equally as substantial. So there could be no such thing as this monad of God in the Islamic sense. So we use the word form in a manner of speaking. This refers to the natural laws and the boundaries amongst types of things and the ecosystems that they create. That's what creation is. An individual object in the natural world is really much less real than the system from what created it. A tree requires everything around it in order to function. The roots are deep into the soil, which is not an accident. Things develop not just in terms of their own internal mechanisms, but also because everything else around them is bringing this about. It's a great argument against evolutionism, that you can't just talk about one. Now, let's say the proboscis on a hummingbird, or the ability of a woodpecker to smash its head against a tree. There couldn't be a time, let's say the woodpecker, whose tongue actually is wrapped around its head, forming some kind of a helmet. That would never simply develop for no reason. And also, if that didn't exist, the woodpecker couldn't survive the way it does. They had to have existed at the same time. But then you consider the woodpecker's stomach. It has to be able to digest everything that it eats from the holes that it makes. The wood in the tree has to be a very specific consistency for it to be easily beaten through. All of these have to exist at the same time. So the evolutionists will say that, the proboscis of a hummingbird, those that develop longer ones, who get deeper into the flower, will thrive far more than those shorter ones. Therefore, the longer ones will be the ones who are mating and become the dominant, and it keeps going. But that only deals with one very small piece of the equation. This is why the concept of the individual, and the way the nominalists put it, is far more arbitrary than they're willing to admit. Orlowski, and I've done more than one lecture on this, says that the individual is extremely arbitrary. So you really can't separate the tree from the ecosystem. The way what its leaves require, sunlight, oxygen, all the minerals that it requires, in this immensely complicated network. Ecosystem is what we're used to calling it. The world being an ecosystem of ecosystems. Therefore, the individual is the least real thing. In human terms, that's an easy one. Human beings are not born free. They're not born equal. They're born totally dependent. They have to be raised in a community in order to give them a fighting chance to do anything. Not only just survive, but to be able to thrive and contribute something. And that dependency never goes away. You don't deliver your own mail. You don't operate on your own heart. You don't, most of you don't build your own homes. I don't even wash my own clothes. But the point is that talking about an individual as if it matters, when even the most hardy of us are totally and completely dependent on other things around us, and that really makes up the anti-liberal point of view. This was the core concept in Hegel's philosophy of right. You take all that into consideration, the individual object, the tree in the middle of a forest, is far less real than the system that's been created to keep it alive. The community, the nation especially, is more real than the isolated individual. To stress the individual as what liberalism has to do, it's a cardinal principle of it. It's to alienate one human being from another. And we've spoken at great length about Thomas Hobbes, how he, because he couldn't accept that his theory didn't work if the family existed. He talked about isolated individuals that sprung up from the ground like mushrooms. The minute you start admitting families, and remember we use the word family, we're talking about a much larger, it's not the nuclear family. Even that is too individual. The nuclear family couldn't exist on its own. So we're talking about large numbers of people, both blood-related and not blood-related. And then these, this is not necessarily a chronological thing, but they overcome dependency by what amounts to the creation of an ethnicity. They need to speak the same language. They have to have the same basic moral values. They have the same units of value, what's valuable and what isn't. This comes from experience. This comes from history. But the one thing that can exist is an isolated individual or a tiny group. Thomas Hobbes created this intensely bizarre, mechanistic, alienating idea of individuals killing each other. The Leviathan, which of course is a demonic titan, Leviathan then is created somehow by these same warring people who suddenly have learned to read and cooperate, which there's no explanation for that. They cooperate just enough to give away as much of their freedom to the Leviathan as is necessary to protect them from each other and themselves. Leviathan then has absolute power. I have philosophy professors who will tell you that this is a monarch, and they don't know the first thing about it. They try to say that Hobbes in the English Civil War was a royalist partisan. And that may be true, but that has absolutely nothing to do with his political theory. His political theory is based on the most extreme version of the nominalist metaphysic that there is. And I've argued for decades now that Thomas Hobbes is the creator of the modern world through both his Leviathan and De Cive. Strauss and others said that it was Machiavelli. But Machiavelli was not really involved with metaphysics and the scientific method like Hobbes was. The system doesn't hold together logically or historically, but the myth has to be told to justify the dominance, not of the family, not of the kingdom, not of the nation, not of the region, not the guild, but this isolated individual who by himself is the most irrelevant thing in the world, since he couldn't survive infancy. They're not turtles. And then the Leviathan comes into existence precisely because these individuals have no other connection. There's no concept of friendship or brotherhood or race or anything like that. The Leviathan is a last-ditch effort that these people who hate each other, for some reason, construct to stop warfare, and it really is for economic reasons. Because what is the point of working on something in a chaotic environment that could be destroyed at any minute? The constant warfare that Hobbes posits is really human nature, prior to there being any law or government or anything. You have first of all, you have no ability to learn anything. You don't have any kind of literacy or culture. You do just the absolute minimum to not die, and that usually fails. The Leviathan comes into existence only because there are no connections amongst these warring individuals. Warring individuals who don't seem to have parents. They don't seem to have any roots anywhere. They're simply ciphers on a computer screen, so to speak. It's a bizarre theory. And yet Thomas Hobbes is probably the most famous political philosopher of the modern world, because he created the modern world. What Descartes did for epistemology, Hobbes did for politics and ethics. And there really are no ethics, because all that a person is this bundle of passions, these internal drives, impulses to satisfy something, sexual or hunger, desire for power, reputation. And actually goes into this in great detail, but that's all a human being is. He doesn't even make distinctions in gender. It's just these completely abstract individuals. And if such a thing actually existed, they'd be exterminated simply because they don't really know how to create institutions. How they come to create a Leviathan, that's never explained. But the broader point is that the economy cannot thrive unless the state or some powerful institution is able to keep the peace. This Leviathan, though, is not natural. Government is natural to humans. Well, let me put it this way. Society is natural to people. Authority is natural to people. Power is a separate issue, though there's plenty of times where it's easy to make that argument. Because there are no universal truths in Hobbes' system, except that the individual doesn't want to die. It's pretty much the only one. Everything that they create, Leviathan, which is not a person, it's a ruling class. It's easy to picture it as a monarch, but he didn't believe in the pageantry of monarchy. There was no tradition. There could be no tradition among these people. And even if there were, it would be completely artificial. When you start from the fact that only the individual, the abstract individual, these people don't even have qualities. They have this one drive, and that's to survive. Like Freud later on, the love and the death, the erotic and the death instinct. And in Hobbes, they are all instincts. There is no reason, but there's only logic. I've made the claim for a long time that really reason and logic are anything but synonymous. In a society that Hobbes posited, logic really ends up being something like rationalization. I don't want to die, and I'm going to do everything in my power to keep from dying. If I'm protected from dying, I'm going to pursue whatever the strongest passion I have at the moment is. People make this, there's no free will. People make decisions on whatever the dominant passion is. So at the moment, if it's money, since there's no real relationships among people, I will do everything I can to get it. The Leviathan may stop me if it's too antisocial, but otherwise, I'll do everything I can to gain it. And hopefully, through all of this, collecting things, property, bodyguards, all that stuff. By putting all that together, they believe they have some sense of security. And the only reason that they have it is that the Leviathan exists. The fact that Hobbes used the metaphor of Leviathan, this sea monster, this demonic titan from ancient mythology, is very interesting. But Hobbes not only is a popularizer of the nominalist idea, he's the most consistent one. If only the individual exists, then everything and anything that a group of individuals will create is then totally conventional. So either society and the government that oversees it is natural, that it's part of human nature to congregate and to develop these universal things like languages and aesthetics and the division of labor. Or it's an artificial imposition that we have to create or else we kill each other. And this idea was consistent throughout the very early modern Western world. And it derives from the endless set of crises set in motion by both the 100 Years' War and the Black Death. The revolutionary changes in this period of time forced everyone to rethink this. But if you're in the process of creating the banking oligarchy coming from the Italian Medicis, then you don't want there to be natural institutions that you have to listen to. A guild can exist only if you control it. Otherwise, you destroy it. Right at the time of Hobbes, you see the transition from the feudal order, for lack of a better term, which is based on realism, to the capitalist order, which is based on the destruction and denial of realism. A nominalist can justify destroying thousands of livelihoods of the peasantry because you are more powerful, and with this land you're going to make more money and contribute more to the Commonwealth. A realist could never justify this. And the only reason that you would react vehemently to someone doing this is that it makes you feel bad. Not in that it's real. It just makes you feel bad. You don't like to see it. You think maybe it could be you tomorrow. That's the foundation for morality, because we don't like how it makes us feel. There is nothing you can't say that I reject this practice because it's against the constitution of human nature. And yet, not only is that certainly, and it's generated far worse than that now. A human being is some self-moving object that has two legs, where, of course, Aristotle defined the human being through universals, reason and freedom, and the two things imply one another. If you're not free, then reason doesn't make any sense, because you have no control over it anyway. If you're free, you're not determined, and therefore you have to, with great care, think through the foundations and your means and ends to avoid overstepping that which is constitutive of yourself. And even putting it that way, it seems so bizarre that somehow, as Plato would say, because of what human nature is, it's better to be punished for a bad deed than to get away with a bad deed. Because reaching your potential as a human being, fleshing out the human nature that we all have, that's a universal. That's a big one. And concepts like right, rights are metaphysical entities. They're not seen that way anymore. They're just instruments of power now. And the only consistent way that a nominalist can talk is through utilitarianism. It's useful. It serves my interest that I do X, therefore I do X. And if someone doesn't catch me, it's perfectly acceptable, because there are no universal truths. Yes, for society, it is much more useful that we don't kill each other than if we do. But if I'm powerful enough and I can get away with killing somebody, there's no sin that's been committed. If no one finds out, then there's no harm done. Plato would say, no, the harm is extraordinary. In fact, the person that you kill is better off than you. Because once you start getting away with that stuff, human nature being what it is, you will start to see yourself in the most distorted way. Somehow you're the exception. Maybe you're even divine. You start to develop schizophrenia. You believe that there are no limits until one day you find that there are. For the nominalist, discovering that limit is the problem. Not that human nature provides the very content of this limit. So, the form, that which is real, the archetype, from which all individuals that we may come across get their individuality from. The nominalist says that only individuals exist, and therefore individuals, through inductive logic, create universals. The universals are not substantial. It's the individuals that create them that are. On the other hand, the realist will say that the whole always comes before the parts, because the parts can't be parts unless you know first what the whole is. An ecosystem has to be posited with all the interrelations and its immense complexity before you could even start talking about individual things within it. William of Ockham held, in opposition to all of this, that universals, and this is a direct quote, are not things other than names. And yet, in the patristic world, and there's other secular writers too, universals refer to the existence of logos and creation. Logos is uncreated, but as Augustine would say, the forms are created. But because they are given their coherence in the second person of the Trinity, the thought of God, so to speak, from which creation emanates, or is constructed, so to speak. The problems of Plato, this heaven of forms, are brought to more or less the concept of the natural law that's inherent creation. You come to understand a thing or two about DNA and RNA, and the level of complexity which really one person could never grasp in the simplest of cells. Strongly suggests that this, in a very broad sense, genetic foundation has to exist before there's any matter at all. Because in the most primitive cell you can consider, the DNA RNA communication is of extraordinary complexity. That can't develop. Genetics, the natural world, can't develop. It can't start from, utter simplicity and become more complex, because the most primitive cell still is not as complex as it is now, but it is still of a complexity that most of us can't comprehend it. Therefore, the whole comes first. The concept of natural law exists prior to there being any individuals. Individuals then are secondary, not primary. So the nominalist idea takes away all inherent meaning in the natural order. It leaves the natural part, but it razors out the concept of order, because order is a set of universals. So when the mind conceives of a universal thing, it's only drawing its own internal picture of the archetypal aspect of a thing, that is, one out of many. It can't go any further than this. When someone describes an object, they're not describing the object. Rather, they have recourse to a mental picture of it. And this is the nature of language. In the nominalist world, it is completely conventional and arbitrary. In the nominalist world, and in Occam's understanding, words can do no more then point to these mental pictures lots of people have about the same thing. And at some point, there's a critical mass. A certain percentage of the population believe this mental picture, and therefore the label sticks. And this is the origin of language. And again, that's where nominalism comes from, because it's a system based only on names and words in a very simple sense. So, as I've said 100 times before, under such a mentality, those with power, the ruling class at any given moment, they decide what is real, what the majority thinks of something. Therefore, industrialization, the scientific mentality, the GMOs, all this, derive directly from the fact that there is no such thing as a natural order. Science has to create it. This is at the foundation of the alchemical system that the Medicis financed in Renaissance Florence and the rest of North Italy. So, for example, in the nominalist world, if I say Socrates and Plato are both white, racially speaking, I can't say, logically, that they're white men. The most I could say is that in general, what I'm saying is it's easy to agree that these two appear to be humanoid. And this humanoid presence, this appearance, has light skin. Beyond this, you can't say anything. It's extremely difficult, however, to live like this, which means that power is very important. Nominalism, once you break free of it, you realize it doesn't make any sense. You can't really talk about anything. Everything is just a matter of who or what powerful people have said is real. I think I've said this before, but Occam's razor. When I hear about people talking about this, when I hear people using this, of course, this is his most famous argument. It does come from William, but like everything else today, it's totally misunderstood and abused. Because appearance is all that matters. Sometimes this is used by people who want to appear smart in front of others. It does not mean, and has never meant, that the simplest answer is the right one, or using fewer variables is better than more variables in an argument or a description. He did not say that. The closest you get from William is, and this is a quote too, plurality must never be posited without necessity, which shows up for the first time in his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard. Now that does make sense, but only in a universe where universals don't exist. Facts are about objects. But when these objects have no inherent relation to each other, the facts become relevant only when someone forced them together. There are no organic connections among things. That's something that humanity has invented. And someone like David Hume completely blew out of the water at the height of the Enlightenment. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, for example, in the Tractatus, he says, Occam's razor is, of course, not an arbitrary rule, nor one justified by its practical success. It simply says that an unnecessary element in symbolism, they mean nothing. Signs which serve one purpose are logically equivalent. Signs which serve no purpose are logically meaningless. So what he means is, by unnecessary elements, they are by definition incorrect. No one needs a principle about this, though. In a world where only random individuals interact with no purpose, the shortest distance then between 2 points is a straight line. But reality is rarely actually like this. One of the key principles of Russian philosophy in the 19th and 20th century, especially the 20th century, is that A does not equal A. That's the old objectivist Ayn Rand nonsense. A equals A. No, because A is something that I have arbitrarily taken out of a system of meaning and am isolating from everything else. A is A plus everything else that I'm ignoring. So, to know something, to know anything, to be able to claim any knowledge in Occam's nominalism, is to believe the factual truth of a proposition, given the conventional definitions and uses of the terms involved. I'm stressing here words conventional. That's an antonym of natural. It's purely subjective. The highest they can go is intersubjectivity, not objectivity. It's subjective. It's a definition of something created by those who have the power to impose it as real on others. So in any sentence that we may utter in making some kind of an argument or making some kind of a claim, for each sentence, terms have to exist in a context which connects them in some way. And these can be entirely invented. In fact, Occam really doesn't give us, and no nominalist gives us any way to tell the difference. So when Occam defines the individual, he has three elements to it. That the object, whatever we're looking at, it doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. This is actually nominalism as such. Nothing beyond the individual thing. There's no organic relations among them. Then that the object is isolated and doesn't refer to anything else. It has no intrinsic organic connections with everything around it. They're ontologically independent and ultimately irrational. And finally, that the meaning of any object that we perceive, that the meaning of an object makes reference to other things. It's a concept of a definition. The other things are conventional and thus not real. They're all human creations. Now, Occam does actually hold that universals exist as substantial entities, but we have no access to them. It's it's a irrelevant distinction. The ideas and forms, because he didn't deny in Logos. He just denied that we had any connection with them. We can't know them. And this, therefore, severs us from God. So, while he'll say that reality, in the true formal sense, exists in the divine mind, and only in the divine mind, that means that we are left with just accident and desire. Impulse, not objective fact. Somehow, God hasn't connected himself, which is exactly what the Logos is. It's the connection of humans with the thought of God, that piece of the thought of God that we require, morally and practically. Now, it's extremely difficult to know how he could know that, except through blind faith. He says it, I suppose, because he thinks he has to. But realism rejects blind faith. The faith that nominalism requires is the faith that the definitions and the objects and the conceptions that we're born and raised with are real. But there's no guarantee of that. There's no anchor. The ignorant believe that blind faith is the same thing as religious faith. Realism, on the other hand, will argue that, well, God is not directly knowable by reason. He can still be deduced from the natural order, as well as the human conscience. I should really say consciousness itself, which seems to be an inherent universal. I mentioned Alexei Losov, who I've been dealing with for a long time now. An excellent philosopher, especially a classicist, living during the revolution and remained in the Soviet Union. He is a vehement critic of nominalism. He's one of the few, although only obliquely, to talk about the implications of this view on society, on religion, even on our mental state. I say that mental illness, outside of the genetic components, can be traced to this idea that there are no anchors, no organic anchors of fact to the way that the world is. Losov says that the nominalist idea is a direct result of bourgeois urban culture. And as Occam is writing, that was just the very beginning of the development of this so-called middle class, as the Middle Ages began to collapse. And it was considered a very eccentric point of view at the time. And it's because objects come and go. They're commodities. The only stable thing is money. Money can stand in for anything. Money can represent any number of objects. The objects itself are always changing, but money is not supposed to. It's money that's the foundation for objects, for things that we see, not the truth of the matter, not any organic connection to any ecosystem or any system at all. The things that are produced are just attachments to money. Because money is completely fungible, that it can be spread over everything, it's the only real thing out there. But even there, of course, it's still a convention. Symbols, a word, a term that we may use, implies that something is being signified. But nominalism can never accept this. Words that we use every day, they signify nothing except what we're told that they signify. So this book, it's the longest book I've ever written. It's certainly the most difficult book I've ever written. I get people asking me, how do you break out of the nominalist system? It takes such a high level of intellectual acumen to stop thinking in these individual terms. It is extremely difficult to do. No one can do it entirely in the West because we're raised this way. It's almost impossible. But this book is a very good first step. The concept of universals is the ultimate debate in philosophy. The one, the many. It steps over into theology through the logos. And that's why I focused on the Church Fathers. The Church Fathers were excellent philosophers. They revolutionized philosophic terminology. But in philosophy departments, with the exception of Augustine, who, by the way, I do not include in this book because I've dealt with him so many other times before, and there's just so much on there. I mean, it's, being probably the best known in the West, and the only real major one at that time in the West. Remember, Ambrose spoke Greek. It's this fundamental evil in modern cognition, the cause of modern errors. These Church Fathers took the work of Plato and Aristotle. Basil talked about Aristotle all the time. And in their debates, theologically speaking, realized, whether it be the two natures in Christ, whether it be Logos, whether it be the Trinity, they needed to take terms and concepts from Platonic philosophy. The idea of creationism, the idea that God created the world, implies Logos. It implies eternal archetypes from which the thought of God, from which matter, so to speak, is informed. And understand, too, as far as William of Ockham is concerned, another implication of his theory is that God can't be known rationally. I don't mean known in its essence, of course. Since you can't accept any universal truth, there'd be no way of approaching the question. This is something that was not lost in centuries earlier. And Ockham, of course, is attacking Thomism. He's attacking Thomas Aquinas, who does argue, pretty much part of question 2, actually, that such a view would lead to pure materialism. There has to be a rational way to at least approach God's action, God's grace. The individual is one of the most persistent and critical myths of the modern world. Like Losov said, it's mythical because it's the creation of a life world that requires it. Like the bourgeois life that accepts this conception of money. They don't like admitting it, but it does rule everything. But it's false not because of that, but because any definition of an individual has to be abstract, like in Thomas Hobbes' system. Nothing exists independently except God. Only God can be cognized through himself, as Macrocus would say. An individual is this arbitrary abstraction from this massive cosmos. That being it. So, this book is unique. It's not been done before. I think that the Church Fathers, although primarily theologians, were also excellent philosophers. They didn't have any choice. Their audience needed this rational way to approach the things of the church. This isn't blind faith. This isn't irrational. This is based on the concept of logos. I always recommend Logos Rising by E. Michael Jones, which is certainly his most sophisticated work. And I'm happy to say, no, he mentions nominalism, I think, once or twice in this huge thing. But he realizes that Logos theology is the center. Logos theology and Platonic realism are very closely related. This is why you see, especially in Romania, Plato and Aristotle being seen as prophets in a way. Yes, they made many errors, just like we do. Plato and Aristotle are as far as the unaided human reason can go in trying to understand the world. Nominalism is a result of a degenerating society. And now, even the individual has fallen apart. Now there's nothing, just the Ein Sof of the Kabbalah. I will set up the link in places to buy this within a few days. Maybe it's there already, I don't know. As soon as it's approved. And please, I would like you guys to let me know what you think. And the last thing I'm going to say is that I'm able to do this. I'm able to maintain this independence and focused work because I have listeners and friends that help support me financially. Those of you who have donated and helped me with it through Patreon or whatever, you're the reason that this has come about. My wife, acting as my manager, is the one who kind of pushed me to finish this. It takes a community for any of us to do much of anything. And I thank everyone for helping me. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.